Nick Charalambous, you are very welcome to the Lead Well podcast.
Thanks very much, Mark. Thanks for having me on.
And I believe it is your birthday today as well, Nick. So happy birthday.
Thank you. Yeah. I reached the ripe old age of 51. So not as big as last year, but still to be celebrated, as my wife keeps saying.
And I also hear that the first thing you did this morning was you went to the gym as well. So admiration, lots of admiration for you. On your birthday, you hit the gym before you started your day.
It was to make up for the wine and the dessert last night, but getting more difficult as the years pass. But yeah, it's just something I like to do if I can.
A nice representation of balance there. You had fun last night and you're up this morning.
Absolutely, yeah. Work hard, play hard.
Excellent. Nick, would you mind maybe giving us a little bit of background in terms of your entrepreneurial journey with Alpha Wealth?
Yeah, so Mark, Alpha Wealth is just over 10 years old. We started back in sort of 2014. Not really with any main intention of starting a business. I came from a corporate background, having worked as a financial advisor when I came to Cork back in 1998, so quite a number of years ago. And before that, I was in London. My parents are Cypriot, which is where my surname came from. I would have grown up in London. I studied economics at the London School of Economics. So I reached a fairly decent kind of, I suppose, academic stage. And I wanted to get into industry. And I always had an interest in finance. Started working in central London for a large investment bank, Merrill Lynch, on a really good salary, I should add. And I kind of realized early on that I was never going to be at that really high salary, the guys you see, in the trading floor. And I got into this sort of middle office sort of environment, which is fine. And it was more suited to my own personality, which is maybe a little bit more kind of maybe measured, I suppose. And then I met my ex-wife, my previous wife, in London, and she was from Cork. And I moved over back in 98, as I mentioned. And it was a tough transition from the point of view that there's no investment banks in Cork. I had to reinvent myself. I was unemployed for 6 months before I found a role, and that was really difficult. My parents weren't particularly happy about me not only leaving the country, but leaving what they perceived to be a really good place, which was London, which was seen as the promised land for many Greek Cypriots back in 73, which is the year I was born. Where they all fled Cyprus because of the civil war. And it caused quite a few issues for them and for me. But obviously, being a stubborn, 21-year-old at the time, I felt that, it was the right thing for me. And I kind of went back and forth and eventually got a role in AIB, working in financial services as a financial planner. And that was my baptism of fire into what I do now.
Excellent. And I'm just thinking how you've described, obviously, that transition and how difficult that must have been for you as an individual. Obviously, for many of us, we do want to have our parents look at us and think, yeah, they're moving in the direction that I want them to. So that must have been a difficult period for you where, yes, you said that you were stubborn, but, how was that where you've essentially made a decision which, your parents are looking, thinking, what is he doing?
Yeah, it was difficult, Mark, and both my parents have passed since. They were that bit older. My father, as I said, he was again, like he was quite successful in London, having gone into the property game, and went from one property, kind of snowballed for him. And still, when even he passed about 5 years ago, you'd swear he didn't have any money at all. Just that there was that sort of old school mentality that, you just always had to work hard, and, he didn't really get to enjoy his spoils. But for me, I wanted to try and then, obviously, look, I took a decision for family reasons to relocate to Cork. I enjoyed the environment in Ireland. I found London to be quite, it's sort of almost like you're anonymous. But obviously getting the role was important, and I strived to do well, and I achieved quite a good level in financial services. I moved between positions mainly to get a better salary, truth be told. Mm-hmm. So I moved into a few different banks, and then more recently that I moved when the recession hit back in 2008, 2009, which I'm sure some of your listeners could fully understand the challenges that brought. moved to an accountancy firm where it was a slightly different type of mentality. You know, I wasn't directly working for kind of a corporate where I was another number. And, you know, you got to that point where you felt, okay, this is almost like a transition into becoming your own boss as such. But if you ask me, you know, did I envisage becoming a business owner? I didn't at all. And all I'd say to people who are out there who are unsure about whether they should start a business or not, I look back and say it was the best thing that I did for financially, for certain, even though I was on six figures working as a financial advisor. And again, that may seem like a large figure to many people, but bearing in mind that, you know, in the interim, I had gone through, you know, I suppose moving where I was financially cut off from my family. I really had to sort of go on my own. And then finding myself in a position where I wanted to just maybe do more. And an opportunity came where I could almost, it was just a case of setting up a business in a shared service office in Cork City. And an accountant that I knew at the time was also leaving that particular firm. And so it kind of made that transition a little bit easier because they had also taken up some space in the same service office. So it was almost like we were moving together.
Very good.
But
Stars aligned a little bit for you.
But it was very separate as well. And ultimately, that same accountant tried to take over my business, which caused its own problems. So having just set up and having to go through all the rigmarole of trying to get the business off the ground, I found myself in a difficult position of deciding whether I was going to stay in that service office, where there was a lot of talk about, you know, combining businesses, but it was more of a takeover from them and almost go back into working for them. And it wasn't out of bad-mindedness. It was just the mentality of an accountancy practice has a financial services company working with them, and the fact that they were seen to be supporting me with clients, it would be natural to then give up some equity. But at an early stage, I decided that that wasn't quite what I wanted. So I had to move offices, and then an office came available in Little Island in Cork. For those people that you know, familiar with the Dunkettle roundabout, it's very close to that. Yeah. And hence, Alpha Wealth moved into its second phase, which was about 8 years ago now. And we've continually just strived to, you know, grow and build on since then.
So what I can hear as you're speaking, Nick, is that you've, from an early age, you have had this high level of risk tolerance. So you're not someone who shies away from taking, let's say, a calculated risk. When you think about, and you've described it quite well to us there, but you talked about obviously having the role, the six figures, but you said the words, but I wanted more. What for you at that point in time, what was more?
So more for me,
I'm sure it's not just more money, right? There's other things behind why we start a business.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And for me, what it was is that I got slightly fed up of working for people and making a lot of money for them, I should add. You know, the mentality was, it was always kind of a rule of four for financial advisors, that you basically got a quarter of what you made for the company. You know, it was kind of, and in some cases it's maybe slightly more generous, but for me, that's what, so I generated about 400,000 euros for these companies I worked for. And I earned 100,000. Quite stressful, you know, obviously very much. I never forget the mentality of, we were talking off camera about, you know, this kind of like mindset of the grudgery of just every day, you just got to sort of apply yourself, and you go from week to week and it all sort of morphs into one. I remember one of my managers said to me at the time, like, if you can't go home on a Friday unless you have 15 appointments for the following week. And it really stuck with me. And it's a mentality that I still have to this day, because it was something that was taught to me, and it's hard to get out of those habits. And financial success, and sorry, I will answer your question, but if you ask me today, Nick, what makes you, you know, good at being a financial advisor? Because that's what I knew I was very good at.
Yeah.
And you break it down, and it's this whole kind of funnel of, you know, you have a certain number of appointments, they lead into second appointments, they lead to sales, and you always have that fall off along the way. And typically for me, it's sort of 3 or 4 qualified meetings a day generally would lead to that success, as long as they are generally, you know, people that could end up doing business with you, not in all cases. So, but going back to your question, the success was being able to determine, what it was that I could actually advise clients on rather than being told. Because
Yes.
a lot of these companies are quite target driven, even though we may not necessarily perceive that. I talk about the banks that I worked with, and, it was very much based on, getting business from our customers. I talk a lot now quite independently to individuals that I meet about the person I used to be. For example, a lot of clients we talk to, in that we don't provide mortgages in Alpha Wealth, but we give mortgage advice. I was the person in the other room that when you got signed off on the mortgage, you were wheeled into, and you would take out the mortgage protection with me, and we were told to upsell the products. And at that stage, you were quite vulnerable because the bank had just offered you the money and you felt probably somewhat tied to doing business with the bank. And as well as that, you were fairly exhausted from the process. So it was easy pickings for the financial advisor. And I say that respectfully. But now with my business owner hat, and what it enabled me to do then is to sort of almost take a step back and say to these people, that isn't what I think would be necessarily the best thing for you, and how can I differentiate and add that value?
Yeah.
And at the time, what did allow me the wherewithal to be able to start the business is that I knew I had a cohort of clients that would follow Nick Charalambous. But the banks actually tried to stop that. We have this kind of, agreement that we had to sign when we took up the role that you couldn't bring clients with you. Yet, ironically, some of them had come to me because of me in the bank, and yet I was being blocked. And, in itself, that was another challenge. So there were a few early on challenges that we had to face, but the biggest one really was personally to try and get to a point of being established. And we joked a bit earlier about, people kept saying to me at the time, why would I join you? You're out on your own. And I often kind of looked at it, and we had we started the company with 3 people. So two others joined me at the time. And I'm pleased to say that they're both still with me, which is great. And we've managed to add, more individuals. We have our 11th person join today, as it happens. And it's not about necessarily the number. And, I always strive to kind of try and do the best I can. And I have that mentality from my father of, hard work generally pays good rewards. Okay, not always, but, if you can try and apply yourself in the right way.
It's nice to hear when I hear you speak about the foundations of why you started the business. There's obviously a personal aspect there in terms of, like you described, but you really seem to have zoned in on the customer and wanting to offer a better solution for the customer. So like you say, that the example that you gave and described where somebody's just got the mortgage. I've only gone through that process myself in the last kind of 2 years. And you're right, like you just want to get this, draw down this money and get this all sorted so you can move into your house. So you are in a vulnerable position. Whereas I think the fact that obviously Alpha Wealth and what you're trying to do with Alpha Wealth is provide a better level of service for the customer in, for example, the position that you've actually described, which I think can be a very powerful reason to start a business. You're looking at a market and you're saying, it's not just all about how much money can we make. It's actually about what's the level of the service that the individual is actually receiving. And I'm not surprised when you describe your first 2 employees have been with you for over 10 years. Because I think when you do start a business like that, let's say with a mission like that, people gravitate towards that mission. People want to help see that mission through from start to finish. So it doesn't actually surprise me that you still have those early adopters who came and joined you in the business, because essentially the mission early on, and I'm sure it still is today, is to continue to provide a better level of service for that customer.
Absolutely, Mark. And, we were often asked, and we were talking earlier about mentorship, and, I took the particular decision not to take a mentor on board because I felt that I knew better. And I joked with one of my colleagues in the office. We referred to this bus and who's driving the bus and how many people do we have on the bus, the bus being Alpha Wealth, of course. And, who's taking the driving wheel, because there were things I was very good at. I knew deep down that I was good at financial planning. But was I good at the other aspects of the role? I wasn't. I had to take over IT systems. I was absolutely useless at that. Dealing with those individuals and managing them, and they look up to me at times, and yet I didn't want the hassle of it. I wasn't, and even to this day, I found like, again, just in terms of my experience with Alpha Wealth, people look at sometimes what I do as success, and particularly as we're getting more ingrained in getting our message out there, and obviously with social media, and they see the shiny stuff, the followers growing, they see the success, and we've had some great successes, and I'm delighted with the way the company has progressed in general. Very impatient individual I am, again, trait from my father. Would I have expected us to be further along the line than we are today? Possibly, if truth be told. We've had years where we stagnated. We've had years where we've, lost one or two staff members and we haven't replaced them quickly enough, even though we still have that cohort of the initial, group. There was about 5 of us that were in the company for several years before we started adding on the newer members. And in that, I went through a divorce, which really took an impact on me and the business. I did get counseling at the time. This is about 6 years ago. And the counselor left one message that really resonated with me. And it probably is the reason why I'm sitting here today, and said to me, don't make Alpha Wealth the reason why your marriage failed. Because that did go through my head. And it was, and the reason she said that is because I felt down at the time, and I felt that, I'd lost my lust for the business itself, and I did blame it to a degree on what had happened. But subsequently, having worked through that, I met my wife, Cleaner, who is now in the business, and she joined Alpha Wealth 3 years ago. We got married 2 years ago. And it's been fantastic for me as an individual and for the company. Cleaner's brought different skills, ones that I didn't really have. And it's brought its own challenges. We don't agree on, we actually have very different viewpoints on certain things. And, Cleaner's more involved in the business development side of the company. And obviously I'm more involved then in the financial planning side. And we've clashed. And people say, don't bring work home.
It's pretty hard.
Pretty hard. But I would never give that up for a heartbeat, because it's allowed us more time, which I've enjoyed. Obviously, and on occasions that isn't necessarily the best thing. The fact that we do slightly different roles, I think, has helped us. So if there's any business owners that, because you do find yourself, even inherently, a lot of business owners employ their partners for tax reasons. Let's be honest about it. Okay, I'm not suggesting that this is untoward, but partners may get involved, particularly if they're, not earning a high income and have the ability. They might be at home with children. They may have, taken a little bit of a back seat for, bringing up a family. It is a natural thing for them to do, even for their children. And I know it sounds a bit strange, but for any business owners that have, children into those teenage years, they should look to employ them. It's very tax efficient. And it's one of the messages that we try and give. And that comes back to the value add. I think the mistake a lot of financial advisors make, by the way, Mark, is that they're very good at product selling. You need a pension. We can give you advice on a pension. What I think they generally are not very good at, and this is what referring to what you said earlier about, how Alpha Wealth could be different, is the things that we don't sell. So, for example, we give advice on deposits, but we don't make any money by giving that advice. We give advice on health insurance. Again, we do not make money on that product. We give advice on mortgages, and we've deliberately stayed away from getting paid on those different product lines. And people often question that, and say, well, why are you going to give the advice? And are you going to continue with this? And we say, yes, we will. Because it's sort of almost like counterbalances the products that we do get paid for. And quite handsomely, I should add. It's a very lucrative industry if you can sell product in the industry. But I feel strongly that, you can't only advise on one small aspect of Mark's finances and forget the other things.
Yes.
And one of the key messages that I've now introduced into our financial reviews is this whole concept of, the short, medium, long-term planning and thinking about these three different buckets and empowering people to actually make educated decisions for themselves. If you said to me, Nick, okay, how would you sort of perceive yourself to be a little bit different, or what really makes Alpha Wealth different? Because I always used to think about this USP, as people used to say to me, and I was like, oh, we're better. I was like, Nick, everyone can say that. Or, we're cheaper. We're a low-cost provider. I could say that to you definitively. I feel very strongly that, we've always strived to provide these products at a lower cost, because the products themselves inherently are quite similar. I sell products from all of the insurance providers, but so do many others. So that doesn't really stand me out. Okay, Nick, so what is different about you? And then I'd say, well, okay, we could argue that we're probably the fullest service provider out there. And what I mean by that is that we've introduced, the deposits, the mortgages, the health insurance. And I don't think there's any other, and again, I'm not saying that to be disingenuous to my industry, that would be as grounded, as in well-rounded in terms of the different product lines. But certainly for me, helping our clients understand, and I spend time in the consultations helping the client to understand about the actual concept of the planning. They don't need to be an expert. A lot of people tell me that they don't understand pensions. And I say, well, you don't really need to understand them. You need to know why you're doing this. Of course you do. The pension is a long-term savings plan. You just get a boost from somebody. Somebody tends to be the tax man. And you try and formulate in a way that they understand. But more importantly is the why. Why is a pension a good idea? Because it can help you towards financial freedom. Okay, then that leads to another question. What is financial freedom? Let's break that down for you.
Yeah.
When does Mark want to try and retire? Oh, aspiration. It would be great, Nick, to think that in my mid to late 50s, I could work less hours, or I could decide I want to go back into sports, which is Mark's main passion, and maybe coach kids, because that would be my love. If you said to me, Nick, is there any job out there that you would like to do that pays equally as well as what you do? It would be coaching kids. It's what I did when I was younger. My son's 19, or one of my children's 19. I have 4 kids in a blended family, and that has been one of my biggest challenges, I have to say. Much more difficult than financial advisor, I can say that. And for me, it was my passion. When I realized I wasn't going to become a professional soccer player, which I found out very early on, when my son was born, and he was born very early into my first relationship, I took on coaching because at the club that he was in, there was no kind of underage coaching team. So from an age of 6, we almost developed the coaching academy, which is very close to where I work now, which is great. And I've seen the club grow exponentially, which is one of my big satisfactions. But, having gone through that, it is something I'd love to kind of do more of. But going back to, myself, I'm 51, and my aspiration is to reach financial independence at 60. And that's changed quite a bit, by the way, from the point of view of changing countries to changing roles. I have 3 different jobs that I've worked in my life, Alpha Wealth being the 4th one. And I see that as my final destination. Cleaner, my wife, often challenges me and said, Nick, you are not going to retire at 60. And none of us know. And the key thing for all of us is that it's not about trying to retire somebody early. It's giving them the ability to.
Yeah.
Why I feel personally that I will is that I feel having this second start at life, if you like, I would like to travel more. That is my key, I suppose, thing. And I'd like to educate myself more in the things that are not really going to remunerate me, if truth be told. Funny enough, I brought my daughter, who's 16, to the grounds of UCC in Cork. And I'd love to go back and it's a really strange thing to say. I mean, who at 51 would like to go back and do a kind of a degree? But it's not that I have this kind of real passion for knowledge. It's just that I found myself like wanting to know more. Yeah. But at the time that I did it the first time around, it was like a stepping stone.
Yeah, and I think it's, when you are at that age, it's okay, what do I need to do to get to the next step on the ladder? Whereas as we continue to grow through our lives, we become generally, not all of us, but we become a lot more curious. maybe if we have a little bit more time, as you're saying, you can then explore other facets, increase your knowledge in certain areas. Obviously, look to chase some of that curiosity. Well, you mentioned quite a lot there, Nick. And for me, what really stood out in the early part of what you said was this idea of knowing your strengths. And maybe in the early days, we can all be guilty of this, that we know what our strengths are, but we try to kind of do everything. So we lean into, you mentioned things like obviously the social media side of things, or, the tech side of things within your business, or managing people early on, whereas your skill was really in that financial advisory. So I'm curious to ask you, because as a business founder, business owner, you do need to have a knowledge on a lot of different things, right? You can't just be a technical expert. What was that transition like for you? Like, for example, with managing people, how have you progressed over the years? What has changed for you in regard to how you view managing people now versus when you might have started the business?
That's a really good question, Mark. So there's a couple of things. Firstly, and I had great people that were there early on, so I have to give them credit for the fact that they definitely helped. And they were more friends. And my personal skill was, and people have asked me, like, what type of business owner are you? And I haven't read a lot of those books. I've followed some of them. Rich Dad, Poor Dad being a book that I really would recommend in personal finance circles for anyone who is interested in that space, was that I was one of these kind of lead from the front. People I felt that if they could see my habits would follow me. That was mine. And I'm not suggesting that that's a great trend to have, but it was what I did. People saw there was a work ethic. They understood that there was no long grass. I've continuously said this in the business. And yet some of these people they're friends of mine. So imagine having difficult conversations with people that perceived as your friend. And I always wanted this kind of like flat structure in Alpha Wealth, where it wasn't this kind of, this organizational chart of Nick was at the top and then people were below him. Now we've had to kind of introduce that because as the business has grown, it's important. You need structure. You do. But it's still very, very challenging. And, people don't like it, particularly cleaner. We've had spats in the office in front of the staff, not unprofessional spats, but real differences of opinion. And at times I've had to pull rank, and I feel crap about it because I know that I might be wrong, but I have to make that decision. And sometimes the buck will fall at the managing director's door. And not always rightly so. I say to the guys, I want them to have input. But we don't always agree. So to answer your point, what I got good at was delegating. And so what I've done is I've given certain people, Cleaner, for example, on the sort of business development side, because she came from that background in pharma. And if truth be told, she doesn't enjoy financial services. She actually hates it, dare I say. And that may sound strange saying that because she's a fellow business owner now. The reason why I think it's helpful is that she provides the kind of, it's almost like the dumbing down, and she gets me to understand the perception from others, because we have this belief that, people should know what a savings plan is and understand, why they should go out looking for the best rate on their mortgage. But it doesn't really always hit home with people, I
think that's the biggest fallacy sometimes in business, is that we expect others to understand what we do, and we don't spend enough time putting ourselves in the shoes of the client and asking ourselves that question, is this really clear? I think so many business owners, we do make that mistake in a way where we just assume, okay, if I understand it, they'll understand it. Absolutely. So I think it makes a lot of sense what you're saying about having Cleena in that role to help communicate a lot of your technical knowledge and some of the key people in your business, their technical knowledge across to the consumer.
Yeah, and there's Rebecca's another one, and then we've started to sort of filter that down and give people responsibility. I think that's the other thing, and it was partly because of necessity.
Yeah,
we have someone starting today. He's a grad student, and he's been thrown at the deep end because we need more support, and there's a few people away. And I said, guys, there's no flour and chocolates. It's just a case of like sink or swim. And I think that will stand to him. I truly do think that. And that's something I've probably learned from experience rather than the hand-holding process.
There's a fine line, isn't there,
there is a
between
very fine line,
like you don't want to completely just go, okay, there you go, figure it out. There's got to be that bit of guidance.
Absolutely, yeah.
But also, if we do handhold, over time, we create that follower over dependence where deep down the individual knows, well, Nick will sort it out for me if something goes wrong. And we don't necessarily want that for the business, for us as maybe the owner or the manager, but also for the individual because it stunts their growth a little bit as well.
Totally, yeah.
You mentioned, Nick, just around having close friendships with staff members, but then having to have the difficult conversation with them. I can hold my hand up and say early on, I probably leaned on the side in my own business. I leaned on the side of, trying to really please the other individual. So if it was a friend, it was, what do they need? How can I accommodate them? I probably put the business sometimes second, which obviously I learned very quickly is not the way to approach it. Where I've seen it done really well is when certain leaders have the skill to be able to know that essentially they're employed by the business, even if it is their own business, right? So the business has to come first, but there's also a human on the other side. If, for example, we're having that difficult conversation. And I found really good leaders can tread that water between, I have a responsibility to the business, but also this is a human being in front of me. So I have to have this conversation, but I'm going to be able to deliver this conversation in a way that isn't going to completely destroy the relationship. I find that was something difficult for me to learn. I'm just curious as to how that's worked out for you and how you might have developed that skill, because you said there was a few people in the business who became obviously friends over time.
It's the part that I've struggled with, Mark, even to this day. And I've had, I have a mentality, and again, I think I try to simplify things because that's how I feel I work best. In terms of I'm very quick at making decisions. So that's one of the things I've realized early on. I did strangely, and sorry, I'm going a bit off point, but I did a speed reading course many, many years ago. I was in my early 20s, and it stood to me even to this day. It's one of the key things I've found myself to be very good at. I can just take this thing of, being able to understand how to read things really quickly. And it saved me a lot of time because a lot of it is down to time and time management. But to get back to your point, in recent times, I've actually struggled with the fact that as I've tried to get the business to grow, and it's not just me, but for everyone, and we're looking at this phase of, we've got to a 10-year mark. People said that now we've become, established. We're not on our own anymore. But how do you scale up? And we were speaking off camera about, our game, we want to try and grow. Our turnover this year is 2.5 million, which sounds exceptional. And it's great. And it's the first time we've got that. We just came out the back of COVID and we were at 1 million turnover. So that shows you how far we've come. Now, financial services is a growth industry, but it's a very challenging industry. And I worry about the competition. I really feel that if we don't keep developing, we're going to die. We will become extinct very quickly. So that's always a fear in myself, which is probably one of the drivers. So what I've done is I've tried to delegate, as I've said, and I've got very good at that. We've implemented things that, this kind of whole concept of being agile, and we work with some project managers, and interestingly, this Project Management Institute, one of the guys who actually was on one of our own podcasts, Pat Lucy, and he's a really brilliant entrepreneur. Really, really, I admire him. And he said to me at the time, you've got to install this thing where, you have these meetings really regularly. Almost I know it sounds a bit strange, but totally different industry, but these supermarkets that you go to, the spas and that, they have that quick sort of 10-minute stand-up meeting every morning. And I used to sort of think, it's just a bit of a chat. But it's the way that they talk about, the business, what happened yesterday, what didn't happen, what were they going to do today? And we've implemented that recently, and it's working really well for us. And Mark, even you've done some work with us of late, and it came at a really good time with the business because I was starting to find that the relationships I had with people, they were becoming a little bit fractious. And that personal business side, I stepped over the mark because of the stress sometimes. You go through different things. Like a mistake happened at work, and I publicly gave out about the individual. Really out of turn for me now, I have to say. I think it was probably the first time it was done. And it was heard by other members, and it caused a bit of upset in the office. I went away thinking, maybe it needed to be said, but it was offside. And I had to, and sorry, not that I had to apologize. I realized quickly on, like, it was wrong. But then there's that sort of, okay, but then I'm going to sort of show a bit of a weakness there. And, and it sounds awful, but, you asked me the question about, how through trial and error, if truth be told. And it's a horrible way to learn, because you don't want to upset people. But the guys know me well enough that the way I tend to manage is, you get it back, so I ask people, and we don't want to sort of do long hours in Alpha Wealth. I feel awful that, sometimes people have had to stay back. I fear that if we can work smartly and adhere to things, during a working day, that should be enough in general. Okay, there may be periods. But then I'd like to think that in reverse of that, if there's a family issue, that is like, it's like unquestioned, and hopefully the mix makes up for the I suppose the pressure, if you like. And generally that's been the view, but getting to this next stage, it's going to take more input, I think, from others like yourself.
Yeah, it's been fantastic though to hear your development as a leader from where you started, and thank you for the honesty as well around, because I think we can all relate to times where maybe we showed up and we didn't represent the type of leadership style that we want to represent. But you mentioned a couple of key mechanisms there that can help us with that in those difficult conversations, and I think the daily catch-ups, like those meetings, those quick meetings, doing that little after-action review kind of on a consistent basis, it also helps people understand, okay, how do I provide value in my role in this business? How do I contribute to the overall goal? And people need that. People need to feel connected to the wider organization. We also like recognition as well. So as much as it's an opportunity to give feedback in order to make us better, it's also a great opportunity to give that recognition to somebody. But I have found that the ability to do that on a regular basis, all of a sudden what we realize is that these major mistakes, they tend to happen less and less because we're giving people that direction on a daily basis. I think sometimes this idea of doing it once a quarter or even once a year, and then people should just know what's expected of them. I think, okay, right, in an ideal world, yes, but in reality, in the society we live in today, where information overload, we've all other facets of our life that can get in the way and impact our work performance. Having somebody who can sit you down and have that frank conversation with you, it's so important for us. So I think leaders, business owners, the ones who invest time up front in doing that, they massively see the benefit over time. I think a lot resist it because it is a big time investment. But then what happens is we maybe have the outburst that we don't necessarily, feel portrays us as the type of leader that we want, or we have dips in performance where people just become a little bit unsure as to, okay, well, what is the value that I'm adding here? So it's great to hear the journey you've gone on in regard to that and where you're at now, where you've implemented those things within the business, because that will not only obviously help you and the business, but it's going to be so beneficial, obviously, for the performance of those individuals within the team as well.
Absolutely, Mark. And I always felt before, and I know it sounds very naive, but if you paid people more money, they'd do a better job because obviously, they fear that they're rewarded. And I realized, I suppose, quite a while ago, is that isn't always the case. I mean, okay, people want to be remunerated, and rightly so. We work in finance, and we understand, the pressures that people can have, and the cost of living crisis that we've all been through recently. But more so is that it's about giving them the tools that they need and creating an environment. I remember when COVID happened, and it was interesting on one of your podcast, Mark, I was listening to earlier, saying about, we haven't really got over the effect of COVID, but it's all been brushed under the carpet. I was out in Dublin city centre last night, and COVID has gone from Dublin, I can tell you that much. But for me, I still have scars, and they're almost like unsaid scars. I remember I said to the guys at the time when COVID broke, I would do my best to save your jobs. I remember the conversation clearly. I don't know, you might say, Christ, you sound like you're this crusader with
sure, I said the same thing myself. It's what pops into your head at a time like that.
Yeah,
you're going to try your best.
Yeah, but what I didn't think of was the effects it might have on what would require that. So I thought, okay, if we can retain jobs, which we did, thankfully, and financial services was an industry that actually grew during it. So ironically, even though we had to adapt and obviously everything went online, the industry did take off. It really did. It was actually very, very good for that industry. But I think it also led to that whole dynamic of, working from home and the pressure that people face, and the different dynamic of losing that sort of almost, that sort of environment where we could have the chats by the water cooler.
Yeah.
And they stopped. And then interestingly, Cleaner coming on board. And we've actually had some younger members, these are kind of recent college grads, where you're starting to hear the chatter, and that banter, which we were missing terribly. So, and interesting, Mark, you were saying about, what is success, and it can't just be numerical. For me, it's having an environment that people actually want to work in, rather than they're coming for a job, and just because you happen to pay a little bit better than the next guy, they might join your company, which is really not the ideal. So we're very conscious about keeping that thing, but at the same time, it's fraught with challenges.
Yes.
So don't think that I've in any way cracked the egg. It's a constant. I find it a constant battle, but it's a really interesting one. And again, for anyone who's thinking about setting up a business, it doesn't take a lot to set up a company, and it doesn't cost a lot. But obviously, you need to be comfortable with the fact that I remember when I left my last role, you have to pay a mortgage and you have to meet bills, and there's a high failure rate, and it's always in the back of your mind. But if what you're doing, if you're passionate about it, I know again it sounds a bit holistic, and I think if you've realized that you can always go back. I think that's the thing that I didn't probably think about, was that, okay, if it wasn't a success, you could go back and take up a role. And
it doesn't need to be the escalation of commitment.
Absolutely.
You can always go back. You don't need to keep doing it if it's not giving you what you need.
No one wants to think that way, of course. But I found a lot of people now that are setting up companies, they're kind of doing the work already.
Yeah.
It's just a different, environment. And we spoke about, having two hats, so the business owner, it's the business, and it's themselves as individuals. And if there's one thing I can say to business owners, they need to understand the distinction very early on.
Yes.
Because
you can't tie your personal identity to your business,
Absolutely.
Your level of self-esteem to your business, because no business moves in a continuous upward trajectory. We all have our peaks and valleys, our down days.
But interesting, Mark, you asked earlier about, in terms of like the business and escalating. The business can become very successful. My fear for business owners is that you talk about risk, and I've actually realized that whilst I've taken risks in my life, like quite big risks, which I wouldn't have perceived at the time, leaving London, really well paid position, sort of getting out of that corporate structure, which provided a lot of benefits like pension contributions, death in service, sickness pay, and it was all lost overnight, and it wasn't replaced, within years. So, and then it's a case of saying, well, okay, what does that actually mean for me? The one thing I'd say to business owners, take risks, absolutely. And we talk about risks in finance and, investment risk. And I'm not actually as much of a risk taker when it comes to my own personal finances, interestingly. I dabbled a little bit in cryptocurrencies, but I got out of it very quickly. A, because I didn't fully understand the movement of why things were happening. And I truly believe that most people probably don't. But B, that I was getting into that speculative world of, trying to make money, of movement. And that's not really where we want to be. It's not trying to speculate. It's doing things. I talk about core and satellite, your core approach being a sustained investment approach, and your satellite being the sort of the periphery where you may have some investment in crypto, and that's okay, but that's not the piece you rely on.
Yes.
But the point I was making is that for business owners, they need to think about putting, wealth into their personal names, because if something does happen to the business, that's the real risk, I find. And we know that businesses can, and we saw it with Lehman Brothers, obviously back in '08. We've seen it with, certain institutions where things can change quite quickly. And that fear that I have, which is always there, it's like this dull kind of pain, is you can get redundant quite quickly if you're not careful. Yes. And that's probably what strives me. So it's actually probably a good thing. It's like that little bit of stress that you have every day.
We all need that. And again, it's how we manage that. And you're describing in a lot of ways how you do manage that. I think the fact that if we were to sit here and say that I don't experience that, you don't experience that, I think people would know that we would be lying.
Absolutely, yeah.
We were only talking about I suppose, what people put up on LinkedIn and social media, and everything looks amazing. But there's not one person who's posting something up who's not in the back of their mind thinking, I wonder how people are going to react to this. So we all have that little niggle with our businesses, or whether we have a role within an organization. We do strive to showcase that value, but we're also aware that it can be finite as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
We can lose those roles, or those markets can change, and our business isn't as relevant as it used to be. So I think what you're saying is making sure that we're not always consumed by the day-to-day, that we're able to get our head up out of the parapet a little bit and say, right, how am I essentially building a future for myself through what I'm doing day-to-day?
Absolutely, Mark. And like you said something to me before, which really resonates with me about, trying not to get too obsessed about success or indeed failure, and trying to find that sort of happy medium almost where, because you are, even as accomplished as I'd like to think that we've become as financial planners, I've lost cases in recent times that I'm really disappointed about. And they hurt. They do. They hurt your confidence. You question. I asked for feedback, and I didn't get it, which made it even worse. And look, that's life. That's business. And we've had some success where it came slightly unexpectedly. And really, what I'm trying to do is I like to celebrate success. I said this to the guys in Alpha Wealth. We should. So we've kind of taken this viewpoint, not everything, but obviously where there's certain things, like Cleaners, talking to me about our year end, and we've done really well. And yet I've discounted it to her annoyance, because obviously ingrained in me, again, my father's in my head.
Yeah.
The fear of being made redundant is in my head. I'm saying to myself, that's yesterday. What is the future? Like, how are we going to grow more? How are we going to develop our social media? But we've gained all these followers, Nick. And I'm like, okay, but it means, like, what does it mean? I can't affect that. What can we do today that's going to affect? And that is a massive kind of like pressure point, because it's almost like, but then you're telling us we're not good enough. And that's the.
And how are you challenging that for yourself, Nick? Because obviously that has consequences for those around you. It has consequences for you. So how are you going about trying to challenge that? Because I think I'm curious to know.
Yeah. Again, Mark, I don't have all the answers, and I have to stick to my laurels insofar as saying we cannot sit back. We won't grow. And the pain is in the growth. That's what I'm encountering. Because you said to me before about, growth requires more effort. It requires more staff, possibly, because we can only do so much ourselves. Okay, we can get more efficient. Processes are obviously very important. And I sometimes get frustrated because I find that, if we were to hire a lot more individuals, which would help, we might lose our identity a bit. I'm not big-headed to think that I'm the best financial advisor in Ireland, but I do think that I will do a job that people will remember. And okay, you might say, Nick, but you should be able to, extrapolate that to others. And to a certain extent, you could argue, but I don't take that view. I feel, for me personally, we would lose our identity. If we hired another 5 financial planners, we would be much more successful. But me trying to create 5 more Nicks, or David Looney is the other senior advisor in Alpha Wealth, and he's fantastic. I mean, he's someone that it's almost like, the apprentice has overtaken the master, and he's a lot younger and better looking than I am, I should add. But the thing is, could we do that? No. And that's probably what stopped us, if I'm being honest, about that sort of early on growth that we didn't see. Yeah. And yet people would say, but you've been so successful. So you're just trying to find that sort of happy medium. And I struggle with it. I do. To this day, I still have those sort of nighttime tremors of, what are we doing? Are we doing what we need to? And I'm in that mentality, which was the old banking way of doing things. You get in and you strive, but then life gets in the way. I spoke about the blended family and the challenges that has brought. I have my kids on days where, I want to start work early and I can't because I have to drop certain kids to school. And yet there are other weeks where I don't have that challenge. So it's almost like, it's trying to find that balance, because there's times where I can't achieve what I want to in that week. And then it's frustration of not, always reaching your potential. And then the following week, I've got more time, and you're trying to sort of just almost like rationalize it.
It's kind of like a nice representation of life, which I think there's a hidden message in as well in regard to what we've been talking about there, is the important role that acceptance plays for us as individuals. And also the fact that life is not just work. Life is many facets. And yes, there will be times that I can put more time, attention, focus, commitment into certain areas, but it's probably not losing sight of some of those other key areas. And that is easier said than done when essentially the buck stops with you as a business owner. So I completely relate to what you've just said there, Nick. Just quickly, to one final question to finish our podcast. And I ask this to every founder and business owner that comes on. But if there was one, and you've mentioned a few today, but if there was one maybe piece of advice, one lesson that you've learned that you would pass on to a business owner in one short sentence, what would that bit of advice be?
It's a really good question. I would say, don't be overly critical of yourself, and just strive to be the best version of yourself. And I know that sounds like a bit of a cliche, but what I'm good at is hard work and graft. And I know that as long as I'm diligent in what I do and I follow through with that, which is challenging at times, especially with everything else that happens in life, I do believe for a lot of us, that's the key ingredient to being successful. So if there's one thing I can say to business owners is just strive to be the best you can, and don't overly criticize, because otherwise, it's a journey that is going to be fraught with sharks and, and you just can't avoid some of them.
I think you're right. For me, what stands out there is you're giving with one hand with the graft, the hard work, but you're taken away with the other if you're overly critical of that hard work. I
mean, one of the biggest things, Mark, and again, it's another cliche, but is realizing, don't get upset about the uncontrollables. I follow Arsenal as a soccer team. I'll finish with this last thing. On the drive up here yesterday evening, I was watching the match against Chelsea, and as a 50-year-old person, getting overly irate about our lack of, ability to win a match, it's totally irrational.
Yeah.
But I still have that. And I lost it for a while, and it came back as Arsenal become more successful. And I sort of had to take a step back and say, Nick, this is not something that you can control. And once we can really kind of ingrain ourselves that, we're okay. Now I have to listen to analysis afterwards and make myself feel better and try and, get some rationalization to why these things are happening. But once you do that, you can sort of, and I think for business, it's the same thing. Yeah. You just have to realize that there are reasons why things aren't always going to go your way. And as soon as you can realize that it's the only things that you can control, then I think that's probably, for me, would be one of the biggest learnings that I've taken.
Nick Charalambous of Alpha Wealth, thank you very much for joining me on the Lead Well podcast.
Thanks very much, Mark. It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.